James is going to be talking about, his subject is I'm stuck and I don't know what to do. Feel stuck in your job or career? Trust me, we've all been there, regardless of outside factors, though you alone have the ability to influence and control the path that your career takes. We'll discuss the ups and downs of careers and how to achieve happiness in yours. And that is, whoa. Hey, James. Okay,
Hey,
I
what's
switched
up?
back and I see you here.
I just appeared. Yeah, I had to ask for permission to get my stuff set up. So
Uh,
hopefully I sound good. People can see me, all that good
yes,
stuff.
absolutely. Okay, so what are you going to be, tell us a bit about yourself and what are you going to be talking about?
Yeah. So this is a personal, like kind of transparent conversation about my career and some of the ups and downs and things that I've been through, and hopefully some pieces of advice for people that are just want to take control of their careers and feel like where they take their career is in their own power, and they have the ability to influence it, and some tips and tricks and things to do along the way to make sure that they get to whatever the end goal is, and that constantly changes, and just to kind of keep in touch with yourself about what really makes you happy.
Cool, man. Well, thank you for hopping on. I'm going to hop off and
Okay.
you can take over the stage. Looking
Cool.
forward to hearing what you have to say.
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks.
Cool. Bye.
All right, I'm going to reset my timer and try to stay close to time here. So I want to start by saying that for me, growing up, my family spent most of their time feeling stuck in their careers. And often I would say that they didn't even feel like they had careers. They might have had jobs, but not careers. Because for my family, a job was just a job. It was something that was necessarily to support a family, something necessary to get by, something necessary to get money, not necessarily something that was associated with happiness. And that was especially true for my dad. Was one of the smartest people that I've ever met. He graduated with a law degree from the University of Memphis in I don't know how long ago, but he practiced law for maybe a few months or maybe a couple of years. I'm not exactly sure. And he realized that this was not something that he really enjoyed, so he quit. And the idea of leaving something that you don't enjoy, that seems like a very honorable thing. But the issue with that situation for him is that he didn't sacrifice money for happiness. Ultimately, he just never found either. It never seemed like after that he had a job that he really enjoyed. It never seemed like he was on a path to somewhere. And he never really made any money, to be honest. So, this talk is about some of the ups and downs that I've been through in my career as a professional. And I want to share with you some of the things that I've learned in the hopes that you can use them to strive for happiness, whatever that may look like for you in your career. So I was very fortunate to start off my career at Microsoft, and I started my career as a technical evangelist, and it's very similar to the role I'm in now as a developer advocate. But as a technical evangelist, you give a lot of talks and presentations and workshops, and you engage with the community and work with people in the community. So at the age of 22, I found myself giving talks to audiences, many of which the people in the audience had been writing code longer than I had been alive. My mentor, for example, at the time was one of those examples. He had been writing code longer than I had been alive. And I find myself, again, at this young age, giving talks to people that have been doing this longer than I had been alive. And I kind of wondered, what did I have to offer these people? And so I felt a lot of imposter syndrome. This is something that I think we can all relate to. I felt like, these people have been doing this for so long. I'm just learning it. What is it that I can provide to them that they don't already know? But the more I started to give talks, the more comfortable I got. I started to realize that people were showing up to hear me talk because I did have something to offer them that they hadn't yet experienced, or they weren't familiar with, or whatever the case may be. People were showing up to hear me talk because I had something to offer. And so the more I did this, I started to kind of wrap my mind around that. I started to build a lot of confidence. And ultimately, that led to a very successful year to me. And a very successful year for me at Microsoft led to a relatively good sized bonus. So at that point, it was time to celebrate. This was my first year in my career. I had done really well. I had made some money on a bonus. I went and used that money to buy a ring to propose to my wife, which I did. And ultimately, about a year later, almost exactly a year later, we got married. And there were so many positive things going on in my life at the time. It just seemed to be going really well. But as I started to kind of think about what I was happy about in my career and the things that I wanted to do and accomplish in my career, I realized there was one big thing that I was missing. And my wife and I had always dreamed about living in New York City. We had visited a couple of times in college. We had spent New Year's Eve there a couple of times. And I realized like that was just something I was never going to let go of. I was always going to have that goal of living in New York City. So I had a conversation with my manager to tell him that. And it just so happened that someone on the New York team had left and they had a spot. And 2 weeks later, my wife and I moved to New York City to join the team up there. And this is actually a picture from the rooftop that we lived, or the apartment rooftop. We lived in the apartment in Brooklyn overlooking the Manhattan skyline. And this is one of, honestly, the best views that you can find of Manhattan. So it was a pretty big transition. With that move to New York, I joined a new team and I started to build different relationships and had to get involved in the community. And the longer I was there, or a big part of that, I transitioned into a new manager. And I had a great relationship with my manager in South Florida, which is where I started. And so I'm adapting to this new manager. And I realized that things aren't really going as well as I was hoping. And one of the big red flags is I feel like he wasn't really paying attention to me. A couple of examples of that is when we would have one-on-ones, he would often be going through the drive-through at McDonald's to get food. He would often be picking up coffee at Starbucks. And ultimately, I felt like he wasn't really paying attention to me. I didn't feel like the things that I had to say he heard. I didn't feel like the things that I said resonated. I didn't feel like they affected our conversations going forward. I felt like I just kind of kept hearing the same thing, even though I was making efforts to make changes. And it just seemed like he wasn't paying attention. And so I get to the end of what ended up being my last year at Microsoft for our review cycle. And I feel like I'd done my job just kind of like everybody else had. And I didn't necessarily do anything spectacular, but I did my job and I kind of had an idea of what my review would be and what my bonus would be. And when I had that conversation with my manager, I was shocked. The bonus was honestly about as low as you could get. And that really, to me, reflected that I hadn't done my job or that I had done my job poorly, when, again, this whole time, I thought I was at least doing my job kind of like everyone else had. And so I mentioned this to my manager, like, I feel like this reflects that you're telling me that I didn't do my job. Can you explain to me why? And he didn't have specific feedback. There was no feedback of, we really wish you had done this. We really need you to do this type of thing. And there was no communication of any of that stuff throughout the year. So by the time I got to the end of the year, I was shocked, I was hurt, and I felt like I had no control over that situation. So my first piece of advice, my first thing that I learned is where you go in your career can have lots of different factors. You can be affected by lots of different things. There's lots of different things at play, but at the end of the day, where you want to go in your career is ultimately up to you. So you have to be your own conductor. You have to conduct yourself or take yourself down the path that you want to be, regardless of any outside influence. Ultimately, the buck stops with you, and it's up to you where you go in your career. And the other aspect of this is that I should have been more vocal. If my manager wasn't giving me the feedback that, looking back, I needed at the time, I now need to be more vocal to drag that out of a manager if it's not coming to me directly. It's my responsibility to get out of those conversations what I need for my career if that person is not going to be proactive about doing it. So looking back, again, I don't think that manager did a great job of communicating with me. I shouldn't have been in a position where I was shocked by the end result of my review and my bonus, but everything is under my control, and I have to now take that lesson and use that in the future of being vocal about the things that are going on. So I mentioned that this was my last year at Microsoft. This is my last review at Microsoft, and you might be wondering what would lead me to leave one of the best tech companies in the world. And what I haven't told you yet is that in May of 2016, standing on that same rooftop overlooking the New York City Manhattan skyline, I got a call from my dad. And my dad told me that he was diagnosed with 6 months to live. And this was obviously a pretty big shock to me. I hadn't expected that at all. And my wife and I decided we were going to move back to Memphis, which is where I am now. And I was going to spend what time I had with him, or what time he had left with him in person. And so as part of this move, I started looking for jobs, and I couldn't find anything with Microsoft that made sense in this area. And so I called FedEx, which is where I'd interned, and called my previous manager and said, "Hey, my wife and I are moving back to FedEx. I would love to come and work for FedEx." And she said, "That's great. We are about to hire 7 or 8 different positions at that time because they had some new work that was coming in. And it seemed like the whole move was going to transition fairly easily, and I was going to get to have some time with my father." Well, it turns out about 2 weeks later, my dad passed away. And so when I expected to have 5 months at that time with my dad, I had about 2 months. And that was obviously very tough. And in addition to that, what I thought was going to be a relatively smooth transition turned out to be a little bit different. FedEx at the time was going to be hiring for those jobs, but it wasn't as soon as I thought it would be. And so I'm dealing with all of the emotions of my dad passing away. I'm kind of sitting around waiting to hear something from FedEx. My mom had passed away a few years before, so all of the responsibility of like dealing with the house and taking or like doing something with all of the stuff in that house basically came down to me. And I honestly can't remember why I put this slide in here, but I was feeling very overwhelmed, and I didn't really know what to do. I kind of felt like my wife would ask me questions about like, all right, what's the situation at FedEx? And I would say, oh, they're going to get back to me when they're ready to hire. And then 2 weeks later, she would ask the same thing. And this is where the slide comes in. She would say, hey, like you're not making any money. That whole the whole eating thing and like having clothes and things like that. We need money to do that. What's the situation with FedEx? And so I realized I couldn't control when that interview might come. It might come tomorrow. It might come in a few weeks. It might come in a few months. But what I could control at the time was making sure that I was as prepared for that opportunity when it came as possible. So I started to kind of take control of what I could at that point. So I started to watch a lot of YouTube videos. I took a bunch of Udemy courses. I started getting into web development for the first time. I started going to meetups. I started spending time in the community, helping other people, learning from other people. And again, my goal was just to be as prepared as I could for that interview when it came. And so the lesson that I took there is that you should always focus on what you control. Again, there was lots of outside factors. There's lots of emotions for me in dealing with the passing of my father, of feeling like I was kind of helpless and waiting for someone to call me for a job interview. It ended up taking 2 or 3 months as opposed to a couple of weeks like I thought it might have. But in the midst of all that, I realized I had to focus on what I control. So I started doing those things, making myself as prepared for that interview so that when I got the interview, I would absolutely nail it and be able to move on to the next step in my career. And so the next step in my career was starting with FedEx. And my wife and I moved back to Memphis. We started with FedEx, and I got introduced to something at the time that was called SAFe. And if you've never heard of SAFe, it stands for the Scaled Agile Framework. And it's basically a framework for doing agile at really big companies, which FedEx is. And so as part of the SAFe framework, you do these 2-week sprints, and every fifth set of 2 weeks is supposed to be an IP sprint. And the IP sprint stands for 2 things, innovation and planning. And the planning aspect is you spend time planning what you're going to work on in the next 10 weeks, while at the same time taking some time for innovation. And people kept pitching to me, oh, we should be doing, or this is for hackathons and like learning and all this stuff. And I realized that no one in this company was doing that. I didn't see anybody participating in hackathons. I didn't see anybody learning anything new. I didn't see anybody embracing what innovation was supposed to be during this IP sprint. So I stood up in a room of not quite this many people, but a room of 60 or 70 people of my organization. And I said, we talk about these things. We say these are things we care about. We say these are things we should be doing, and we have to be doing so that we continue to progress as a company. But I don't see anyone doing that. And so we had that conversation, and ultimately I took on the responsibility of kind of setting up these mini hackathons where we took 2 or 3 days out of this innovation and planning sprint to really do the innovation aspect. So we did hackathons, and we had learning dojos, and we took courses, and we just built stuff, and we explored, and we got creative. And this is an example of one of those where we did an IoT event of 2 days, and we had all this different piece of hardware, and we had lights going off, and it was really just a lot of fun, but also started to really embrace our creativity and capabilities and learning inspiration as developers. And so with that being relatively successful, growing and getting more support, I got lots of congratulations and great job and kudos and well done and all these things from upper management. But one thing really stood out to me, and that was thank you for being vocal. Everybody or lots of other people had sensed the same thing. They had heard us talk about something that we didn't really do. They had seen that happen, but those people didn't necessarily stand up and be vocal about that issue. So that was one of the things that really stood out to me. So in the idea of being vocal, I at some point during this had a conversation with my manager where she asked me, do you see yourself going into management or continuing to contribute as an individual contributor? And I said, for me, I would like to not necessarily do the day-to-day as a manager, but I would like to be a leader in technology. I've already kind of shown that that's what I like to do. I can communicate, I can give presentations, I can stay on the bleeding edge of technology and make recommendations. And so after that conversation, a few days later, my manager came in and said, we have this open position for an architect. Would you be interested? And that was my opportunity to be that leader in technology, to help make those decisions and communicate that down to people. And I said, yeah, absolutely. And at the time, this was a double jump in terms of a promotion. So I skipped a level in between, something that had very rarely happens. I don't really know of an example of when it had happened. And so at the age of 27 at the time, I don't know this for sure, but I probably became the youngest architect in the company, and maybe ever, I don't know exactly, but probably one of the youngest architects at the time. And so I took that knowledge, and this is actually like one of those diagrams that I drew and kind of teaching my team. But as being an architect and being in some of those decision-making strategies, I got to take trips to Amsterdam with my team, and we got to go out and have a good time and kind of bond as a team. And my wife got to come over and be a part of that process too. And did I mention that I got to fly first class? That was really cool. But as I started kind of getting into this architect role, I realized I was spending more and more time in meetings, and it was really draining me because I felt like my time was being wasted. I felt like I was in meetings that I didn't need to be, and it was wasting my time. And that's one of my biggest pet peeves is I hate when I feel like my time is being wasted. And I realized I also missed creating content. I missed giving talks and creating YouTube videos and being a part of the community and all those things. And I also started to look around me, and my complaints that I would have about being in meeting is what other people would say also, but their mentality was like, this is just how it is. This is how it's going to be. And they're basically just going to ride this thing out until they retire. And this kind of freaked me out because it sounded oddly similar, very similar to how my dad would have approached his career or the jobs that he had. He never felt like he was in control. He just was basically at the whim of everything going on at whatever job he had. So long story short, I left FedEx in December of last year, and I joined Auth0 as a developer advocate, which is where I am now. So in the middle of that process, one of the last points here is I learned to pay attention to my mood. I had a good job at FedEx. So I made a decent salary. I had stability, but I wasn't really happy after a certain point. And so my recommendation is to you is to always check in with yourself and be really honest about yourself, about how you're feeling. What is your mood? Are you really happy with where you are? And my advice there is if you're unhappy with something in your career, it's up to you to make that change. And I posted something like this on Twitter, and I got lots of feedback saying like, that's really nice and all, but some people don't have the control to just up and leave their job. And I wanted to address that. And I wanted to be clear that like, yes, I absolutely agree with you. You can't just up and leave a job. Not everyone has that next opportunity, but what can you control? You can take a course on Udemy to help build your skills. You can watch some YouTube videos to help build your skills. You can immerse yourself in the community. You can find a mentor. You can be around people that are doing similar things. You can build a personal site. This is my personal site that I took on as a learning project for me. You can go to meetups. You can do all of these things. Those are the things that you control. You might not be able to automatically just leave a job, but you can make progress for whatever that next step is by working on that in the time that you have. So kind of thinking about this, if I had the ability to talk to my dad one more time, I would say that if you're unhappy with your career, it's up to you. You don't have to do it all at one time. You can take baby steps. I would say don't procrastinate and mind the gap Think about how happy you are, where you would like to be, and then take baby steps to get there. My name is James Q. Quick, and I am a developer advocate at Auth0. And I consider myself to be very lucky, and I'm very happy with where I am in my life and my career today. But in honor of this talk, I owe it to myself every month or every couple of weeks to check in with myself and reflect to make sure that I am still happy. And if those things change, which they might, and they very well could on a very frequent basis, it's up to me to take those baby steps to get back on track and get to where I want to be eventually. You have that responsibility for yourself as well. So one closing thing, and then I think we have a few minutes for questions, is I would really appreciate if you have any thoughts or feedback on this talk. You can submit that at a0.2/feedback-jqq. And you can pick and say you saw a session by me. If you have feedback, I would love to hear it. You can share it. And if you fill out a little bit of information, there's an opportunity for you to get a t-shirt as well. So all in all, thank you for hanging out with me for 15 or 20 minutes. I think we've got a few minutes for questions. So if you have any, feel free. Thanks for sharing that link in the chat, by the way.
Hey, James, how's it going?
Hey, good.
Thank you so much for your awesome speech. I really connected to the whole, you can control what you can currently do. That's something I was sharing with people recently because, right now the job market's tough, sure, but there are a lot of other things you could do to make sure that you keep progressing as a dev. So I actually have a couple of questions I was able to gather for you, but I don't know if we'll be able to get to all of them.
Okay.
So I'm going to get started with the first one, if my Mac stops lagging. Okay. So the first question for you comes from Alyssa K from Juneau College. They say, my question is about tech tests and challenges. What do you think about these kinds of interviews? I think it'd be interesting since there are a lot of people who prefer to not give those kinds of tests because people tend to do worse under pressure. What do you think about that?
I think it's one of the things that's not going to go away. Like lots of us kind of agree that probably doesn't make the most sense in most interviews. Like it just doesn't, I think, like lots of people have that opinion. So I think it's not going to go away. So I think you just have to be practical with yourself, like know the type of interview that you're going to go in for. And if that's a job that does a whiteboarding interview, then that's what you're going to have to prepare for if that's the job that you want. Personally, the way that I conduct interviews is I'll kind of have some conversation. If you talk about a project that you've worked on, I want to have a technical conversation about that project. If you can explain to me how the different pieces fit together and have a conversation about why you chose to use this thing instead of another thing, that's really powerful for me. I personally wouldn't hire off of a whiteboarding interview. I hire more off conversationally, and then you being able to explain and talk about things that you've worked on in a technical way. Because I think the most important thing for me, you don't necessarily have to have all the skills and experience right then. You have to be able to learn and be willing to learn quickly and be able to adapt on the job. So those are the kind of things that I look at. But like those type of interviews, unfortunately, probably aren't going away anytime soon. So if you're looking for roles at those type of companies, that's just something you'll have to prepare for.
That's very fair. The second question comes from Twitter user Drew Learns, and he asks, what are the best questions to prep for in an interview?
General behavioral questions. Tell me about a time that you've worked with a team. Tell me about a time that you failed. Tell me about a time that you worked on, that you led in a project of some sort. I mean, those are pretty standard. I think you'll have those in lots of different interviews. This also varies based on the interview. So my biggest piece of advice is ask what to expect in your interview with HR or whoever you're talking to beforehand. And they will tell you this will all be behavioral. We'll have a mix of behavioral and technical. We'll have whiteboarding questions, that sort of thing. And based on that, you'll go ahead and prepare. Assuming you get some sort of like whiteboarding problem, there's all sorts of HackerRank and those sort of sites where you can do practice problems. And I would recommend doing a ton of those and doing as many as you can to be able to just hopefully get as much experience going into those interviews as possible.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think that a lot of people think that they can't go into the interview and ask the questions too, but you absolutely should, because it shows that you want to learn more and you really want to, get a better understanding.
Yeah.
So the next question comes from Ilya Nikitin, and he asks, how do you choose what to learn next? Things after JavaScript, React, and front-end languages. These are some things that Juneau College covered during boot camp. Which languages make you more noticeable to employers? And Ilya specifically is thinking, like, should he dive into backend more? So that's
Yeah, great question. So my recommendation is yes. I think early on it's great to have the experience of full stack, front end, back end, like building a full application for a couple of reasons. One, it'll help give you an idea of which side, if not both, you enjoy more. So if you say I love front end web development, well, how do you know if you haven't done back end that you wouldn't enjoy that as well? So I think having that experience for your own learning is great. That'll give you a better idea of like, here's where I want to take my career. I think it also opens up more opportunity. So if you can do full stack development, now there's that many more opportunities that you're potentially qualified for because you're not just choosing either stack. Not to say that you can't, if that's what you really want to do, that's fine. But having the experience does open up more opportunities. And then even if you go into a front end role, having an understanding of how the back end works and how APIs work and how that stuff fits together, that's going to help you be a better developer anyway. So my recommendation is always get some full stack experience, build some sort of application that you can have on your portfolio, that you can list on a resume, that you can talk about in interviews. And then you can kind of decide, like, do you want to do full stack? Do you want to do front end, back end? That's up to you. But having the experience, to me, just gives you a better skill set to talk about in interviews, and then also for you to make your decision on what you enjoy the most.
Yeah, I totally understand and agree with that. I think that some people don't think that they're able to test out these other things while they're job hunting, but it's totally doable, and it gives you the better understanding on what you should be focused on and what makes you happy.
Yeah.
And
one more point.
Yeah.
I think I wouldn't worry too much about what specific stack or language you choose. Honestly, unless you really know that you want to apply for a job that uses this certain one, just pick one and run with it. And those concepts, if you understand concepts in one, they will apply to the other. So it's not really going to hold you back that much if you choose the wrong one. You're not choosing the wrong one. Unless you have like, I want to do this specifically, and this company uses React. Now I need to learn React or Node or whatever.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Thank you for adding that. And I think we'll add one last question. So Matt Jackson asks, one thing I've been wondering is how a new developer balances using the newest cutting edge technology with learning to best utilize the current standard practices. So specifically, how to use the new ECMAScript features.
So I think I'm assuming this kind of comes back to like how much time, like what are employers going to look at and respect most? And I would say a lot of companies are not doing like the latest and greatest that comes out every day. So I wouldn't necessarily think that, like, I have an alarm for some reason. I wouldn't necessarily think like you have to do everything that comes out all the time. I would say build your core skills, and like in JavaScript, for example, like build core skills in JavaScript, and you can, if they use newer features, you can use those too. But if they don't, you can contribute because you know JavaScript as a whole. Yeah, it's easy to get distracted with like how many different frameworks and tools and things that come out all the time. But I would say like take your time and strive for understanding versus speed. Like make sure you really understand the things you're working on before you try to take on something else.
Yeah, well, that's great. Thank you so much, James.
Yeah.
So this is just about our time with James today. So thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure. And I think that you've definitely helped the community in terms of what to look for and what to expect in their upcoming careers. So thank you.
Yeah. Cool. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah. I'll see you around.
See ya.
Bye.